There we go. First fail. That's the second fail in terms of hashtag mic on mute. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for what I hope to be a very exciting session. My name's Mariam, in case you haven't met me before, and I'm the media manager here at Bond. But one of my other hats has been working on a critical piece of work at Bond, looking at language that we use. I don't know about all of you, but I know last year was a massive moment for Bond as an organisation. Black Lives Matter, Shift the Power, all of these moments really forced us as an organisation to reflect and look at the language that we're using. In a nutshell, where we got to is we basically developed a language guide, and off the back of that, I had lots of fascinating conversations with colleagues across the sector, but also importantly with civil society organisations from around the world, and that helped inform that piece of work. Off the back of that, I was very keen to have a session here with Bond Conference to pull some of the key thinkers and speakers that have helped inform this piece of work, both for other organisations, but also for Bond as well. And I'm delighted to have some excellent people here with me today. I'll quickly introduce the panellists, and then I'll run through the session with you. Hopefully it'll be an interactive one. I'm really keen to get some audience reflections and insights, as well as hearing from the panellists here today. So firstly, we have the lovely Shannon Page with us. Shannon is the Peace Fellow at Peace Direct and has been the lead author of Peace Direct's excellent report, Time to Decolonise Aid. I would urge you all to take a look at that, and we'll hopefully be able to insert the link at some point during the session. And we've got the brilliant Fadili, I'm going to butcher your surname now, Magia, yes, I knew it, Magia, who is the director of Sub-Sahara Advisory Panel, a network of African communities in Wales working in international development and across Wales. Fadili is also the founder and director of Watch Africa, Wales's African Film Festival. And we also have Martin Drury here, who is the CEO of Health Poverty Action, who's been an incredibly important voice in the debate around how unhelpful narratives around aid and development have perpetuated for many years now. Prior to working for Health Poverty Action, Martin was the head of campaigns at Christian Aid, played a leading role in Jubilee, 2000, Drop the Debt, and the trade justice movement, as well as Make Poverty History. So what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to get the panellists to share 3 words that they would like us as a sector to refrain from using, for want of a better word. And I want them to put forward the case as to why. Why would they like us to avoid using these words? After that, what I would like you all to do is help us develop some more positive framing, some new words that you think actually, as a sector, we should try and promote. Be that using words that reflect what, aid and development actually does. So, official development assistance is sometimes a phrase that's preferred, or rather than using beneficiaries, maybe we should be talking about the communities we work with instead. So I want you to all come armed with your thinking hats, and to be ready to put forward some valuable suggestions that will help inform this debate. And then what we'll be doing is we'll be opening up to the panelists and also to the audience for a Q&A. Right, so I'm now going to hand over to Shannon. Shannon, tell us what your 3 words are and why.
So my 3 words are capacity building, neutral, and diversity. So I'll break these down. Capacity building, firstly and foremostly, has a huge amount of implications when we're talking about building capacity in local communities. It's assuming that those communities don't have valuable skills that we can build upon. It's assuming that we as foreigners, as Westerners, as people from the global North, quote unquote, have the ability to educate others. And lastly, it's really devaluing the communities that we're working with. It's going somewhere and failing to see the people who are already there, failing to see the efforts they've already done, and failing to truly engage with them. And so I think it's doing a disservice to our own efforts and to the people. And so capacity building, I think, should be retired. Similarly with neutral, I think often aid and philanthropy more generally thinks of itself as apolitical, as neutral. And that simply isn't true. you know, we all have positionalities. My identity affects the way that people view me, the way that people engage with me. The fact that I'm American, I'm speaking right now from Washington, D.C., the fact that I speak English fluently, these are all things that impact how people relate to me. And so to act as though I can ever be a truly neutral actor means that I'm missing some of the complexities of the dynamics when I'm engaging with local communities. And so we really need to be willing to assess that we aren't neutral. And furthermore, and I think this is more difficult, is the fact that a lot of us come from organizations that have historically caused harm in the regions that we are working in. And so we don't get to come from, you know, again, to use my example, the United States, and say, well, I'm a neutral actor, because the United States has a complicated relationship with a number of countries and a number of regions. And so we really do need to be willing to sit with the fact that we aren't neutral. And finally, my last word is diversity. And this is definitely a controversial one. I don't think that diversity is a useless word, but I am just a bit concerned with the ways that I've been seeing it used recently. I think increasingly people are falling on the word diversity to mean everything from ensuring that there's gender equality in the workplace to ensuring that there's class diversity as well as racial diversity. And those are very, very different things. And so really what I'm urging us to do is to retire the word diversity and use more specific language when we're talking about who we want in these spaces, because it isn't enough to say, oh, well, great, look, we have Black people at our organization. Okay, but do you have any Black people in leadership positions? Do you have any women in leadership positions? And so I think diversity is no longer serving us. I think it's becoming too comfortable. And how can we find a better word to really address what we mean?
Excellent. Thank you, Shannon. Very well articulated and put across. Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. That was one of the key points that came through when we were working on the language guide. It was very much about being as specific as possible and not using generic catch-all terms. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Fadili, what are your 3 words?
Thank you, Mariam. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and happy Africa Day. Got my attire on. So I've been a bit greedy. I've gone for 4 terms, which one of them actually is kind of lumped 2 into 1. So bear with me. I've got third world and developing countries that's coming together, and then I've got experts and field work. For me, to start off with third world, so to speak, and I think that word is a dying word in many ways, but there are many people still using the term third world to imply, obviously, lower economic countries. But in many ways, for them, it's almost when you refer when you use the term third world and such, it's almost you're operating the completely different realm to everyone else. You're in a completely different space, different way of thinking. And obviously, there's a huge amount of jargon or at least baggage that comes with it, because the term came across or started during the Cold War, and people continue using it and still using it until now. And at that time, it was referring to obviously the First World, which was the first world where the USA or the economic powers, and then you've got China, Russia are the second world, and then you've got all the rest of the countries who had to choose either the first world or the second world. Yeah, they were a mind-boggling term to use. So it's great that we are using less of that, but at the same time, the term itself was almost displaced or by developing countries, and people moved from third world to saying these are developing countries. What does developing country mean? At what point does one say, "Oh, I've developed enough. That's it"? You know. So there's a huge issues to really to use the term developing countries, because at what point or how do we measure one has developed to the point where there is no further development, and how do we then include those countries that are underdeveloped? And it does imply a lot of inferiority complex that exists between countries globally. My second word is expert, and this is slightly controversial as well, similar to diversity maybe in some ways that Sharon mentioned, because some people might see themselves as experts in something. But my challenge is almost at what point does one become an expert? In many ways, when you look at the areas, communities that we work in, those people in those countries or communities are not considered experts within the sector. They are considered beneficiaries in many ways. I'm using that term because that's what we've been using. but it's something that we don't look at it. In my organization within Sub-Saharan Advisory Panel, it's made up of Africans who are living in the UK, are living in Wales, and we decided to call ourselves Advisory Panel because in many ways, a lot of people who have been in the continent, they do come back after 2 or 3 weeks of doing a dissertation or research and claim you're an expert or something. We as diasporas living in the UK have lived and still contributing and very engaged and very connected in countries we come from. We're not considered an experts. So it's a very loaded word, and I think definitely looking at how we talk about it is really important. An expert on nutrition or an expert on certain fields, certain scientific fields is probably different compared to, say, a community development expert. I have major issues with that. And that's similar to field work as well. What does that mean, field work? It's almost like a scientific experiment. It's almost you're going to the ground and exploring and looking what's happening and testing things. It's not really a nice way to imply when you are working with communities and you say you're going field work. So please, I definitely urge people or organizations or individuals who are using field work to retire that word and use something else. That's all for me. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Fadili. I know one of the conversations that we had as well was around this idea that the word expert is thrown around without any form of legitimization as well. So, you know, often we will say that the UK as a country is an expert on delivering X, and there's lots of questions around, well, where is the evidence for that? And are we just calling, you know, countries or nations experts just to flatter egos and to suggest that, again, it's that power imbalance that we're ultimately continuing to perpetuate by using certain words. So
absolutely, and we're devaluing lived experiences of those people in so many different ways. Just to add to that. Sorry.
Absolutely, no, fascinating stuff. Thank you for that. Very important contributions. Martin, what are your 3 words?
Thank you, and I completely agree with all the 6 words that have been named so far. So I'll tell you my 3 in one at a time because I want they're in order, decreasing order of importance. So for the first one, I had a message quite recently from an old school friend, and after he'd had a chat, he said, "How are things in the aid sector?" The aid sector. That's how he perceives my working life, and that's my first word. Aid. And I think we probably recognise now, it took us a lot of decades to learn it, but I think we probably recognise now how much the aid narrative undermines our cause. It's hard to think of anything that undermines our cause as much as that, the aid narrative. The idea that the world's poor are the needy beneficiaries of their generous benefactors in the minority world. Firstly, it's counterproductive. Ultimately, it leads to victim blaming, and that's precisely what makes it possible for Boris Johnson to cut the ODA budget and for it to be politically popular. So it's counterproductive. And secondly, it's a lie. It perpetuates a fundamental lie about history. If my home's burgled and then the burglar returns the stolen goods, that's not aid. Yet that's what we're doing. We're returning just a tiny proportion of stolen wealth. So it's counterproductive and it's terrible education. Terrible education. It perpetuates a lie and distracts attention to real causes of poverty. And yet it's a word that is used to define us. So that's why it's so important. And it's just not necessary. Many years ago, the UK was part of a global compact for the United Nations to agree to give 0.7% of GNI to contribute to the common global good. And yet now, precisely at the time when the world should be pulling together like never before, the UK, standing alone in the world, is cutting this contribution to the global public good. That's the kind of narrative about shared humanity, common good, takes you to a completely different place to the A word. We don't need to use the A word. And if that would be a challenge. Just go a month, just go a working month, each of us in our working lives, and try to not use that word for 1 month, and see how it changes the framing of our messaging, and to see how it changes the framing of how we think about our work, how it changes us inside. So that's the first word, which for me is the single most important one. The second one, if we don't call ourselves the aid sector, and I've done it, I've said the A word, you see how easily you slip into it. If we don't call ourselves the A word sector, we call ourselves the development sector. And that's my second one, development. And again, it's similar reasons. That splits the world into two. Countries who are developed and those who are underdeveloped, trying to play catch up, trying to grow up to be like the developed nations. And the concept of development is, again, problematic. To us, in the sector, what we mean by development, we mean progression towards global equity. Equity between countries and equity within countries. It's as much about equity of power than it's about equity of wealth. But that's not what it means to governments. That's not what it means to most of the rich world. To most of the rich world, it means economic development. It means economic growth. It's fine for the rich to become richer, the world become more unequal, as long as some of that drops down through trickle down to benefit the poorest. It's the opposite of our cause. That's what it means to many. So it's a crazy thing to call ourselves. The climate justice movement wouldn't get so far if it called itself the carbon movement. Yet we're repeatedly called the aid sector and the development sector. I've used both the aid and the D word there, and I'm trying not to. So those are my main two. The third one, which is less important, but is the word need. And that's something that we don't maybe use so much in our communications, but we do sometimes talk about people in need. But we talk about it a lot internally. In fundraising in particular, we say you have to show need in order to get people to give money. And that takes you straight back to the A word narrative, those in need and those who meet their need. And that's not what we're about. That's not what our cause is. What we need to do is to show the human consequences of injustice. And the thing is, once you label it that way as injustice rather than need, you can then be quite explicit in depicting that, because it doesn't take people to a position of pity, it takes people to a position of outrage against injustice. So you can be much more emotive. So those are my three, but the two is the A word and the D word. And I would say, I know it's hard for some organisations, it's hard for all of us because it's so ingrained in us. It's particularly hard, some of us have got that one of those words in our name. So, there are things we can do to minimise that damage, but at least in our narratives, in our advocacy, we can use different language. And I think that would, if every one member went a year without using the A word or the D word, the political context of our struggle would be transformed, I think.
Excellent points there, Martin. Yeah, I agree with pretty much on all of them, surprisingly. Martin, your microphone's a little bit scratchy, I think. So I don't know whether you've got any headphones at all, but if you have, that would be super helpful. In the meantime, I'd be really interested just to hear from Shannon and Fadili. What do you think the UK NGOs need to do in order to reclaim a lot of the language that politicians use around aid? So in the UK, we're very interested, particularly in Bond, to have a look at, well, how do we reclaim this narrative around what we do when we also have, an aid budget, we have official development assistance, but there's also a government narrative and a political narrative around aid as well that's almost working at the same time as us also describing our own work. So it'd be interesting to hear from you both as to how do we go about almost reclaiming that language from those who are in positions of power that also have a stake in how we describe what we're talking about. Sorry, that's a big question, but I'd be very interested to hear what you both think.
Well, I'll just jump in. I think firstly, we need to be willing to be political because, as you said, Miriam, it is a political conversation. governments have vested interests in framing it in a particular way. I know that during many of the conversations I've had around this topic, some people are suggesting that we move from using the word aid to using the word reparations. And I think, you know, if the UK government were to start framing aid as reparations, there are huge implications behind that. It would be an acknowledgement of harm done. It would be an acknowledgement of the need to make amends for that harm. And so I don't think we're going to see that shift from aid to reparations without, you know, a significant movement. And so as a community, I think we need to be willing to say, okay, well, this is an ongoing relationship. We as a country have said we value human life, we value human dignity, we want our fellow human to be living in a certain standard. And so that's why we're doing this. It isn't pity. It isn't, you know, because we're some sort of moral leaders. It's truly because we view ourselves as equal. And if we hold that as our central tenet, then there's certain things that have to change. And I think both Martha and Fadili like touched on things that will have to change. But part of that is we have to be willing to be political, and we have to start by acknowledging that a lot of our relationships with other countries and communities, specifically this type of funding relationship, has been rooted in racist and discriminatory beliefs. And so we need to start there, because without that acknowledgement, we're going to keep finding new ways to do the same thing and just have a different term. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you, Shannon. Fadili, it'd be really good to get your reflections on that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I do agree with Shannon, definitely politicizing the movement, I think itself is a very important thing to do. And with that, basically, is using different approaches. I think it's really important that we have these discussions, conversations with members of the communities, members of the general public, because the remnants still remain within how people talk about other countries. You know, the miseducation or misunderstanding of how these terms are used, or how their understanding of issues altogether. Because you might go, you know, I'm based in Wales, you go up to the valleys and someone will call it a third world country or developing country or poor country, and use those terms as well. And we see our leaders, the most boring thing, we see our leaders in the UK and the States using terrible words to talk about countries to which most of the partners here work in. And so really politicizing it is very important, and that includes engaging governments in those conversations. They need to be aware. I think this conversation has been lacking, or has existed in some parts within the sector, but not necessarily in those political policy making spaces. And I think those corridors need to be told, need to hear, because at the end of the day, there's a huge power dynamic element that exists within it, to which funders are perpetuating the use of these very similar terms that we are talking here. You know, as Martin said, needs. A lot of funders will ask you, how did you address the need? So we need to start from that standing point. And I think if you start from a government level, the likes of DFID, you know, the Merge or USAID, making that statement in the first place, and hopefully then other funders, the trust and foundations and other funders will be on board, and then hopefully that will go into the organizations and maybe into communities as well. So it's almost, that's how I see it personally. And you have to look in different ways. In Wales, interestingly, we are kind of going through a shift right now. We've never called the sector international development. We've called international solidarity for a long time, but it has operated as international development. And right now we are really, really pushing it in terms of the decolonizing agenda and calling it international solidarity. Yeah, so I think that's my thoughts. The key other point I want to make is possibly also bringing the partners on this discussion, especially when we're talking about engaging politicians, engaging governments. I think we need to hear more from African leaders of African countries, leaders in South America and other countries as well, talking about it, saying about it. These things need to be decolonized. There's other words that we can use. And I think the more we hear from them, the stronger it is our case to make changes here.
Excellent. I completely, yeah, it's very interesting because really then it turns what I put forward to you as a question on its head, because really it's not about the NGO sector reclaiming the language and narrative around aid. It's actually about civil society in all of the countries that we work in reclaiming how we talk about what we all do collectively. So no, really incredible insights. Martin, let's test out your audio and see if we've managed to fix the scratches. So yeah, it would be interesting to hear some of your reflections on some of the comments that were made by Shannon Fadili. Oh, you're on mute.
Does that sound any different? Okay. Right. Well, I heard some of. I heard some of what was said, but I was messing around with the microphones, and I very much agreed with the parts that I did hear. One thing I'd say is about. I think it's like any change. It's overcoming just the inertia of the status quo is always one of the most difficult things. And we all use these words daily, day in, day out. Now, if we were to have a huge international conference where we got together leaders from the majority world and agreed new language that was a recommended language, I'm sure we'd then still adopt it. And I think we should try to do that. I think we should have that dialogue. It shouldn't be people sat in the UK determining what the language should be. It should come from the majority world. But I think we could be pretty damn sure that words like aid and words like development wouldn't be their choices. So until we've got some better recommendations, we need to do better. We need to start changing our habits, and it's a discipline. I think we need to start with the things that are published when it's written, because then we've got time to do the word count. How many times the A word in there, the D word, all these other things. Identify some key priorities to change, and then we'll find alternatives. And let's just, we don't all need to agree, right, this is the new word. Just start using alternatives, see what catches on, create the culture of exploring alternatives. But I think there's huge power in it. This is the language that defines what we're about. It affects the way we work. It affects how we educate, how we communicate to others, and it affects how we think and feel about it ourselves.
Exactly. I agree, Martin. Yeah, no, fascinating reflections from all of you about also the importance of this agenda as well. I mean, language matters now more than ever. And I think even though as a sector we've thought a lot about, images and representation and, making sure that we accurately reflect what it is that organisations do on the ground, and even that we've not entirely cracked yet. But one of the things that I've not heard discussed that much is the words that we use. So hopefully, this will be the start of other organisations also reflecting internally on whether it's appropriate, the language that we're using to reflect what we do. Right, so I can see already some votes are coming in for words that we would like to start using. So what I'm going to do is, if you can, as an audience, I'll be very grateful. So you've heard lots of discussions and arguments as to words that we should stop using, but one of the things that we saw internally at Bond as a challenge is thinking of alternatives. So I'd be fascinated, and you've been informing basically this piece of work, if as an audience you could help come up with language, words, phrases, replacements to words that we use internally as a sector all the time that we know we're not comfortable with. So it's always that little gut feeling that makes you feel, oh, I don't feel that word's right, or I'm using a bit of jargon there. If only there was another word that I could think of, but I don't have enough time. So we want to help each other think of those alternative words so that there's almost no reason for us to go back to the language that we previously used, because we've got a guide and a toolkit that we can draw on. And I completely agree with the panelists, we're not going to get this right immediately, but over time, as our language evolves, we're moving in the right direction. So hopefully we'll be able to get to a much better place than where we are at the moment. So while you all put in your votes, I'll give you some ideas. So phrases like communities that we work with. So let's touch the word beneficiaries. Let's stop talking about aid, but then what's a good alternative to aid? Should we be a bit more specific and talk about, water and sanitation, or toilets or clean water, the way we do in the UK when we're talking about healthcare. We use real words and everyone understands what we're talking about. So why don't we do that when we're also talking about the projects that we run as well in various parts of the world? Instead of using phrases like developing world or, somewhere in Africa, why don't we be more specific and actually talk about the country that we're referring to, or, the exact region? So a lot of this, some of it's about generalizations. Some of it's about, how we speak to government and sometimes mirror their language, and not always using the quotation marks that are needed to make it clear that it's not our language, it's the government's language that we're holding them to account on. But some of it's also about jargon as well. So, even the phrase beneficiaries, where did that come from? What does it even mean? We don't talk about beneficiaries when we're talking about communities that we help in the UK. So why do we translate that language into, our context that we work in? So while you all think about that and get your words in now, I'm going to just pick up on some of the questions that have been coming through from the audience. So a great question here that I've got here for all of you is, how do you counter the narrative around aid without changing the actual sector rather than just language? Great question there. Shannon, let's go to you first. What do you think?
I think changing language is the first step in changing the sector. I mean, I will speak for myself. I'm hoping to change the sector. I think that we need significant shifts in how we've been working. And the goal is that by encouraging people to reflect on what they're saying and the implications behind what they're saying, they'll start to realize that there are certain untrue implications and biases that are motivating the way that they work in different communities. And that will hopefully as well change the way we do projects, change the way we build partnerships, and change the way that we do funding, most importantly, I think. And so, yeah, I think it's very much a first step and definitely not the be all end all, which I hope people don't take it as, the final step when we're talking about shifting the system.
Very well said. Agree. This is only one small part of a much bigger agenda here that we all really need to collectively commit to if we want to address it adequately. Fadili, what are your thoughts?
Language is really important. Absolutely. I think when we're trying to decolonize the sector, language is how we communicate with our funders, our communities, civil society. So I think it's really important, but I think it's not the only thing that needs to, obviously it's not the only thing that needs to be done. A number of things need to be done in tandem with decolonizing the language or the narrative within our languages. In Wales, we've been doing a series of events last year called Decolonizing Development. And within that, basically language was just one strand of it. We looked at poverty porn. We looked at the history of international development. You'll be surprised how many people do not actually know where the sector started, how it was formalized into where we are right now. Because we have big organizations and we have small organizations that are working in various parts. And I think people do come into the sector at different levels or different interjections. So it's really important for people to know where we started in the first place. So within the series of webinars that we did, we looked at all those areas. And that's really important, I think, in terms of how we are moving forward, how we are changing the sector and how the sector works. We reflect and look at those issues, and also looking at language, poverty porn. How do we capture images that are not dehumanizing? Yeah, there's so many different pillars that I can talk and go into, but I think they need to exist in tandem with language.
Absolutely. Martin, what are your thoughts?
Very much the same. I think the whole purpose really of changing our language is to transform ourselves, both as organizations and as individuals even, and the political context in which our struggle operates. So if we, even when we're lobbying on 0.7, we don't need it. We're counterproductive if we keep using the A word throughout, because it doesn't work in favor of 0.7. It works against 0.7, and it reinforces all the messages about the sector that we want to get rid of. So I think, yeah, we can make it clear we're talking about 0.7, and then just use a different term to describe it throughout the report. throughout the press release. I'd love to see everyone using talking about the reparations budget. That would be a political message in it. But if we can't do that, I mean, solidarity is a great word. Anything with equity, those are good words that take us to a very different place and a totally different political analysis.
Agreed. Unsurprisingly, I'm a very biased chair, as you can tell. I've got another question here. So what are the thoughts from the panelists on fragile states? Coming from Afghanistan, the word I use at IDS about Afghanistan is that it's a fragile country, which I felt was a disrespect. I think using such narratives and terms should be reviewed in Oda narrative. Sorry, that's a question to all of you. So let's kick off with Martin. We'll go around the other way around. So Martin, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I think I haven't thought through that one, so I'm not sure what I would suggest as an alternative. But I think typically the language that we use in the global equity sector currently tends to define those we're talking about as being different to us. So we don't consider the UK to be a fragile state. Its government's pretty fragile, but we don't consider it in that way. It's a label of otherness. So I do think there's an issue in the term. I think the unaccountability of states that we consider fragile, the unaccountability of governance there, the weak infrastructures, that make it impossible for people to claim their rights from the state. I think those are all major issues. But I think the label itself, I would agree, I think we could do better.
Thank you for that. Shannon, Fadili, what are your thoughts? If you have any suggestions as well for an alternative, do share.
Yeah, similar to Martin, I think it's something that I haven't come across so much, but definitely I do agree that there is, it's definitely problematic. And I think, and I'm putting the word together probably with vulnerable, the way you use vulnerable as well, and disempowering or empowering, kind of the same bracket, so to speak. I don't have an alternative, but I think one thing I'll say is probably just to go with what Shannon said earlier, is being specific. If you're saying the country is fragile, is it fragile economically? Should we just say this country is economically well, X, Y, and Z, rather than trying to call it fragile, or politically X, Y, and Z? It's much better, I think, when we try to. And when you say fragile as well, do you imply in every single sense, for example, as I said earlier, economically fragile, socially fragile, politically fragile? So it lacks clarity, in my opinion. And that's why I think specificity is really important when we're talking about these things.
Shannon, what do you think?
I think it's another term that means a lot of things. So we'll say fragile states, and we mean a lot of things within fragile, and similarly with, vulnerable states. And I really am, as I was thinking about this and listening to Martin and Fadili, I was just thinking, well, why do it's such a permanent statement when we say fragile states that leaves very little room for those countries to be anything but that. They have to transition into another state. And I'm thinking, why couldn't we say something along the lines of states experiencing insert the particular issue that we're talking about, to Fadili's point? So if we're talking about economic insecurity or precarity, then we could say states experiencing economic precarity. And to me, that feels like a less permanent state of being when we're talking about those countries. It feels as though this is a period, this is a particular experience that is currently going on. And then, they can move through it and reach another experience, more so than fragile state, which feels like a finite title. But I will say again, just specificity when we're talking about these issues, and again, considering the implications of what we're saying, because fragile, it implies a brokenness, implies honestly an inability to fix itself and a need for others to come in. So I definitely think it's another term to retire, and I'm glad that it was brought up.
Absolutely, I agree. I think also one of the issues that I have with the word fragility, it's similar to poor or poorest. It doesn't explain what has happened to put those people or this country in the situation that it's in. So it's almost just said, well, it's just fragile, and that's just it. Whereas I don't know how, I've not really thought this through, but even saying conflict affected, like that tells you that something has happened in order for this country to be in the situation that it's in. And we're not going to, say whether it's fragile or not, because how do you even define, fragility? And is it for us to say what's fragility, or is it for the community there to say whether it's fragile or not? But it still explains what's going on there and what the issue potentially is. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and a very important and thought-provoking point there. So thank you for that. So we've got some really good words in, and we've got 5 minutes. I'm going to very quickly just share the words that have come through, and reassuring to see that many of these are in our language grid, which I would encourage you all to have a look at. It's of the same title of this session, but words like, let's have a look. So rather than beneficiaries, we've got very much around project participants. We've also got phrases around participating communities. So it's very much around partnership and working with the communities to deliver these programs. So I think that's a significant one. And then there's a lot of very similar suggestions around that. We've got bilateral learning. That's a really interesting one, because that again speaks to this idea that there's no one expert, and we're not necessarily building the capacity, but we're sharing and learning together, which is very much what a lot of this is about. So that's a great one. Instead of beneficiaries, we've got rights holder. Brilliant. We've not picked up on the importance of rights-based language, but that's a really, really excellent suggestion there. And that's one that I don't have in my language grid, which I will now be stealing. Thank you very much. We've got partners, partner stakeholders. All of these words are excellent because they very much speak to the quality of the relationship that's going on there. And I think that that's such an important point and foundation to almost start from. So yeah, thank you for those. Any reflections from the audience, or any words that you would hope that we could continue to use as a sector or replace other words that we should really let go of? Let's start with Fadili.
Oh, I was thinking about it, and any words that we can continue using. I think I came across diplomacy rather than soft power, to which I think in many ways it does tell the power dynamics that exist when using soft power, and what's the hard power, what's soft power. So I think using the term diplomacy, for me, it's always that thing of saying things as they are. In the UK, we've got Black and ethnic, BME, the word that we use, for example, Black and ethnic minority, to which a lot of people are not happy about, and rightly so, because you're lumping a group of people into one category. For me, using the term racialized, for example, stays what it is. People are being racialized for who they are. So being very clear, very direct with how you're explaining and talking about things is how we should talk about how we should use our language, so to speak.
Thank you. Oh, very good, useful and important insights there, and completely agree. Shannon, what are your thoughts?
The term that I'm landing on is white gaze. So we unpack this in our report, but just this idea that the way that the, for lack of a better word, unfortunately, Martin, the way that the aid system, the way that, philanthropy works is that we privilege this idea of progress that is, using Europe, using the West more generally as the standard that every other country is supposedly trying to meet or should be trying to meet. And that's what marks quote unquote development, what marks quote unquote progress. And so I'm really struck by the necessity of being grounded in the understanding that most of our frameworks, most of our understandings of what it means to enter into these relationships with communities are rooted in this idea of West is best, and there's like this idea that we should all be striving to recreate what is happening in various Western countries, rather than really acknowledging the beauty and successes and strengths of many countries and regions around the world. And I think unpicking that will go a long way in recognizing that we aren't superior simply because of where we're based, and really creating these true relationships and true partnerships.
Excellent, thank you, Shannon. I think we are coming towards the end now, but Martin, if you have some very quick thoughts, get them in now.
Yeah, very quick. Two competing reflections, I suppose. So one is just the importance of this. You know, it's not optional. We have to make these changes. As a white man, you know, working in the development sector, who's born and raised in the UK and has benefited from all the privilege and distortions of power that come with that, how dare I use the A word? How dare I keep perpetuating that narrative? So there's no option here. There's a sense of responsibility. And the almost slightly tension with that is that none of us, I don't want anyone to feel that we should be on eggshells when we're using language. You know, I guess any word that we use, it might be wrong. Of course it will be. You know, we're all subject to all these influences. We're going to say things that are wrong all the time. We can just try to get better and start to establish new, better habits that harness the power of language for the cause of justice.
Excellent, thank you, Martin. Couldn't agree more. We have a responsibility and a duty to get this right, amongst many other things that the sector has either intentionally, unintentionally perpetuated. We need to address it now, and now is the time. There's an appetite here to get this right. So let's pick up on that and actually draw on it, and actually go back to our organisations and think, you know, let's have a conversation about this. Are we actually, you know, observing our policies and practices? Is there a guide out there that can help us get started with some of this conversation? What does the process for developing our language look like? What should it look like? You know, how can we make sure that we're not unintentionally perpetuating the very thing that we're trying to tackle by once again developing phrases and words that actually reflect our values and not what we're actually doing on the ground and the communities, most importantly, that we work with, as well as the legacy, the historical legacy that much of our work is based on as well. So we really have a duty to get this right. Very quickly, I'm closing up now for the session, and thank you so much for joining. Do check out our guide that's on the Bond website that's called Decolonising Aid. Yes, lovely to have you all today. And thank you to my lovely panelists. Excellent session. Thanks all.